please keep your cameras off. We also ask that you mute yourselves at this time. My name is Jasmine Shoemaker, and I, along with my colleagues Emily Cullen, Susan Graham, and Simar Yohannes, run the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop Series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in one-hour talks hosted in the library or virtually. Due to the ongoing success of the Spotlight series, we have expanded the parameters to create a semester-long themed symposium every fall semester. This fall semester-long symposium, titled Prison State, aims to explore the regional and pervasive impact of prison incarceration in Maryland and the current debate around prison abolition. The inspiration for the theme comes from the library's special collection's prison-related materials. Today, we welcome our 8th speaker of the symposium, Betsy Tolentino. A graduate of Southern Oregon University and Widener University School of Law, Tolentino's career has focused extensively on criminal and juvenile justice advocacy and policy development aimed at improving and building systems to meet the diverse needs of our communities. Her experience includes representing and advocating for criminal defendants and children in Maryland's foster care and juvenile justice systems before trial courts, the Maryland General Assembly, and system stakeholders. Betsy most recently served as the Maryland Department of Juvenile Justice's Deputy Secretary of Community Operations, where she focused on changing the way young people, families, and stakeholders experience justice system interventions, mitigating racial disparities and developing a fair and equitable approach to reform, and empowering opportunities for shared innovation with partners to become a catalyst for change. In addition to her current role as the Managing Director of the Roca Impact Institute, Betsy volunteers with community-based organizations, serves on the Mentor MDDC Board of Directors, and is an adjunct professor here at UMBC. Her presentation today is titled Maryland's Journey to Reduce Juvenile Detention 2010 to 2021. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here today and to talk with all of you online and here in the gallery at UMBC. Being here at UMBC is such a opportunity to also recognize the commitment UMBC has always had to young people who are justice involved through the Choice program that's here at the Shriver Center and through a lot of the classwork that can occur here on campus. So we're going to talk today about Maryland's journey and how Maryland looked at juvenile incarceration and what Maryland's Department of Juvenile Services and other stakeholders did to make a meaningful reduction over the past 11 years. So leading up to 2010, Maryland was sort of really starting to experience and seeing the impact of the years of juvenile mass incarceration through the 80s and 90s with the super predator theory out there that was debunked, proven not to be true, with the very restrictive and punitive laws like mandatory minimums, charging youth as adults, just flooding money in that resulted in a lot of incarceration. And although many of those policies and strategies were really targeted at adults, young people were very much wrapped up into this mass incarceration. So by 2010, we really saw Maryland experiencing very high populations of young people in juvenile detention. Whoops. Let's see if we can get there. There you go. So what is juvenile detention, right? So we sort of need to start there. You're going to hear this a lot today as we go through the talk. Maryland defines juvenile detention as the temporary care of children who are pending court disposition and required to be in a secure placement for the protection of themselves or the community. Now, I really want to focus in, that's sort of the rule. You're not supposed to use juvenile incarceration unless it's for the protection of the community or protection of the young person. And so that's something we really need to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. So detention has been proven. So as you know, we led up, like I said, in 2010 to mass incarceration, really seeing all these young people wrapped up in the juvenile justice system. Also catching up at that time was the science and the research. There was a lot of information out there about, you know what? Young people's brains are different. We can't treat them like many adults. They develop differently. They have different relationships to what is happening around them. They react differently. They don't understand consequences the way adults do. So we should treat them differently. The Supreme Court was even acknowledging the differences between young people and adults during this period of time. And the research really directed us to show us that detention had a very negative impact on a young person's mental health and their physical well-being. It showed us that incarceration increased the self-harm and suicide attempts young people were experiencing, contributed to poor education outcomes. When young people are incarcerated for any period of time, they're not going to school. Many young people who are incarcerated have special education needs that don't get met, and then re-entering back to their communities and building those connections with school is incredibly difficult after a period of incarceration. The research tells us there's very negative impacts on mental health. If anyone needs to mute, go ahead and mute your line. We're getting a little feedback. Really negative impacts on mental health. It also led to decreases of employment and ability to assimilate into the cultural norms of your community, and also increased exposures to trauma, which we also were learning at this time that trauma had an incredible impact on adolescent development, and being in a facility with the locked doors, with the handcuffs, with the restrictiveness is just another layer of trauma that really had an impact on a young person's ability to recover from that situation. We also know detention has a negative impact on community safety. So as we looked at the research that was being conducted on how young people were experiencing detention, we're also looking at, well, does it get us anything good? And what the research told us is really no, it really doesn't. When you're incarcerating young people who don't need to be there, they're more likely to continue in that delinquent behavior. You will see increased recidivism. Young people who get incarcerated, even for the briefest of moments, are more likely to be pulled deeper into the juvenile justice system and receive more punitive, more restrictive, more intensive responses to their behavior. And detention can really disrupt what is sort of the natural flow of adolescent development, that you're going to age out. Most young people are going to learn, they're going to have experiences, they're going to fail at things, they're going to have consequences, and they're going to age out of this time period where you're likely to engage in juvenile behavior that can be considered delinquent. But when you lock someone up and you sort of stunt that development, then you're unlikely to be able to age out of that as expected. Detention also exacerbates already existing disparities within the justice system. At every stage of the criminal and juvenile justice system, great disparities exist, and youth of color are very more represented in juvenile incarceration than white youth. They are also very much more likely to be arrested for very similar behavior that white youth engage in. They're very much likely to experience more severe and punitive interventions, and disparities increase as risk decreases. And what that means is we saw when we got even deeper in the data and looked, all right, let's take a look at the low risk kids who are in detention. Well, those disparities are even more pronounced than they were when you looked at the high risk population in detention. So we need to also be familiar with a few other terms as we go through this process of how we looked at detention, how the Department of Juvenile Services attacked this situation. So we need to understand what are alternatives to detention. And again, Maryland law defines this for us. And it's a program monitored by the Juvenile Services Department in which a child alleged to be delinquent is placed in a home, a parent, a guardian, possibly a shelter, which is like a short-term placement, as a condition of their probation or as an alternative to being detained. This includes electronic monitoring programs, evening reporting centers, and pretrial supervision. Evening reporting centers are centers that are popped up around the state and around the country as states try to look at how they can respond and use other alternatives rather than incarceration for appropriate youth. And evening reporting centers basically operate in the evening from 3 to 9, and they provide activities, food, tutoring sometimes some therapeutic or treatment interventions to keep young people occupied, because what also we learn when we dig into the numbers is young people are most likely to commit offenses between 3 and 9. So let's just keep that time period of, busy and away from the communities where they may be engaging in other behaviors with other youth, and provide some sort of support while they're there. The other term we need to understand is pending placement. So pending placement is a term you're going to hear me talk about quite a bit as we go through and so understand the problems that we are experiencing in Maryland and how they were responded to. So pending placement refer to youth who are post-adjudication, meaning they were arrested, they may have been detained, they went to their adjudication, which is like a trial, they received a sentence, and the judge said, hey, you're going to go to a residential committed program because you need to get treatment services outside of your home, outside of your community, and in this facility. However, young people wait in detention sometimes to get their spot in those facilities. And so we're going to talk a lot about how that contributed to the overutilization of incarceration in Maryland. And we need to really sort of just have a little bit of an understanding of how a young person flows through the system in Maryland. So the juvenile justice system is incredibly complicated. There's on-ramps and off-ramps pretty much at every single one of these boxes. But to keep it simple and for the purposes today, essentially a youth can be arrested or a complaint can be filed with the Department of Juvenile Services. That's how we find out about the young person. About 90%, a little over 90% of the youth who come to the attention of the Department of Juvenile Services are going to come through an arrest. When we get that, and when the department takes a look at that complaint, then they decide, okay, are we going to detain or not detain? And DJS can look at the complaint and they will say, we're going to detain this young person, we're going to use one of our alternatives, or we're going to release the young person. The very next court day, the judge reviews that decision, and the judge gets the same sort of options. They can continue the detention, they can continue an alternative to detention, or they can release the young person, or they could also, if the young person was detained, they can put the young person on an alternative. So after that pretrial sort of stuff happens and the youth is in their either detention, alternative, or release, then there's going to be a trial to look, well, did this actually happen? Is the young person responsible for this act? And that's called an adjudication. In the adult world, we call it a trial. And then there's a disposition. In the adult world, we call that a sentencing. And at that point, the judge essentially sort of has two options. Well, really three. They can do nothing, or they can put the young person on probation, or put the young person in a residential committed program that meets their identified treatment needs. So what did it look like in 2010 in Maryland? Over 40,000 youth were arrested and brought to the attention of the Department of Juvenile Services. 7,429 youth were placed in detention in that fiscal year. On any given day, there were 452 kids locked up in the state of Maryland. At that time, probation caseloads were about 7,000, and on any given day, a little over 900 youth were in committed treatment programs. And you can see in the circle graph here, this is the placements in detention by offense. So in that fiscal year, the white area is all the misdemeanor offenses that resulted in placement, which makes up the majority of all placements. The darker gray are those that are felonies, things that you would think are more severe. You can see placements by region across the state, with Baltimore City really driving the placements, followed by the metro region, which would be Prince George's and Montgomery County. And then this is the youth disparity. And you can see of this 6,337 youth of color were placed in detention in fiscal year 2010, compared to about a little over 1,000 of white youth. 85% of youth placed in detention were youth of color, even though at that year, youth of color only made up 40% of Maryland's population. So you can see there is an incredible disparity that existed at this time. Not even half of the youth placed in detention were assessed for risk at that time. We didn't use risk assessment tools to help us make good decisions based on what, we can predict could happen. On any given day in fiscal year 2010, we were about at capacity at the Department of Juvenile Services. So that means on some days we were over capacity. Other days we might have been a little under. But there were only 467 beds at the time. And any given day, 452 were full. And almost 45% of the detention population on any given day were those youth pending placement. So that's almost half of all those kids of that, 452 were just there waiting to go get the treatment that they needed. And a place in detention that doesn't provide treatment. When we talked about that, going back to that definition, we're going to do this often, it's supposed to be there to protect the community or the young person, right? It's not there to provide treatment because we don't know at that point, most usually, because we're thinking this is a pretrial, intervention, if they did anything wrong. They could be not guilty. We have also dug in and we don't know what is going on with this young person because we can't do that until we know if they're culpable for the behavior that they were charged with. So also I just sort of show some of the end results in a way right here, but this is juvenile complaints. And like I said, this is really a proxy for arrest. This is what's coming to the attention of the department. So we had that 40,000 or so in fiscal year 2010. By fiscal year 2012, it went down to about 33,000. And as you can see, there's a huge decline as we go to fiscal year 2021 with this big drop here between fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 2021. And we'll talk about that just a little bit on its own because that's our pandemic time, as well as some other sort of reforms that were going on. But crime is going down, right? This is what this shows us, that less kids are being arrested over time. So we should be seeing less kids being incarcerated over time. So we saw what was happening in fiscal year 2010. We saw that, we had these great disparities, that we were packed. There was no room. That a lot of the young people were there for misdemeanor offenses. And a lot of people were just waiting for treatment. So we knew that this didn't seem right. This was not clear and not aligned with that purpose of detention and that definition of detention. So the department brought together groups of strong leaders and developed some collaborative structures to push change, and at the same time, just dug into those numbers to identify how kids were coming in the system and how they were experiencing the system. So what that led to, that analysis and that research, was the DJS Doors to Detention report in 2013. And prior to this, there was a Doors to Detention report just for Baltimore City. This was a statewide look. So to really understand how kids are getting into the system. And I think what was most surprising is that only 1 in 5 youth were coming into detention because they were charged with a new offense. That meant everybody else was coming into detention for other reasons. And those reasons really fell in these buckets of alternative to detention sanctions and violations, to writs and warrants, and violations of probation. And you can sort of group those all together as the young person not being compliant or appearing not to be compliant with the conditions that they were supposed to be following in the community. I want to be clear that these are conditions that they were supposed to be following in the community, not new crimes, right? So at this time, also every county in Maryland was doing all of this different. You may have one county in Maryland who said, you know what, you don't show up for an appointment in person in my office, you're going to get a sanction, and that sanction is going to be going to jail. You don't go to your treatment, you're going to get a sanction, and that's going to jail. You don't go and do all the things you're supposed to do. I'm going to file a violation with the judge, but I'm going to recommend you go to jail, right? So there was justice by geography. Everyone was doing things a little bit differently. There was not really a real structure to identify when those really high level interventions should be utilized. And there wasn't a lot of structure around what else could you do? Because again, we're not supposed to use that door unless it's for the protection of the young person or protection of the community. And there's a lot of other things that you can do for young people who just don't show up for an appointment or aren't going to school or haven't gone to their treatment program. There's a lot of other interventions and supports that can be levied to be able to help young people get on that path of compliance and success. The other thing, when I said we brought together this group of people, I have to mention the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. This is a partnership with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I know next week you're going to have Nate Bayless come and speak, so just a little plug for him. You're going to learn a lot about what the rest of the country is doing as it relates to juvenile detention. They are at the forefront of really pushing strategies that are proven to work, and also at the forefront of really being innovative and bringing together stakeholders to come together to a common solution. So the core tenets behind JDAI are really structured around collaboration, that data, the commitment to race equity, objective decision making, making sure that there's some way to take away some of the bias and subjectiveness to how the systems are operating, expediting that court processing, looking at special cases, sort of like those, how did you get here? You don't sort of fall in any of the boxes. How can we find other ways to respond to that kind of behavior? And really improving the overall conditions of confinement. So around 2010, Maryland really renewed their commitment to the JDAI collaborative in Baltimore City. And we've had an ongoing JDAI work group with judges, law enforcement, public defenders, state's attorneys, juvenile services staff, among others, community members, city members, to really look at this problem holistically and come up with shared solutions. The benefit of Maryland being a state-run system is we were able to leverage all that work in Baltimore City and utilize a lot of those initiatives across the state system. It bears mentioning that not everyone around the country works that way. Many counties have their own sort of juvenile justice systems in many states. So for example, Ohio basically operates its own juvenile justice system in every single county. Here in Maryland, that whole flow chart of the system falls under the Department of Juvenile Services. So when we're making a policy change, it just doesn't apply to Baltimore City, it applies to the state. And so we're really able to make sure to try to pull out some of that justice by geography and ensure that kids are treated similarly across the state and have similar access to interventions and responses. So I sort of look like our story in sort of three phases. There are a lot of procedural changes and collaborative strategies that we're going to go over. Then there was the pandemic response. And then we had the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. And I should put a few question marks at the end of that one because that's sort of still ongoing. We have some new rules to the game, some new laws, but we're not quite sure what level of impact they have had yet because it's that new. So just thinking that phase one, really making sure the procedural changes and collaborative strategies were put in place. And that involved a lot of these different steps that you see here on the screen. Really making sure we utilize that validated risk assessment tool. So let's talk a little bit about that for a second. So risk assessment tools are essential to detention reform. It allows for a set of questions to be asked and responded to really identify, is there a chance this young person, are we going to predict that they could engage in further criminal activity if they weren't incarcerated? So you look at factors like what they're charged with. You may look at factors, did they not come to court in the past? Have they escaped? What's going on with them now? Is there current charges? Are there pending charges? Are you currently on probation? Are you currently on an alternative? And what's the severity of all that? And we worked with the Maryland Institute for Innovation to develop a tool that is predictive of whether or not a young person is going to commit a new crime if they are released. And we assess risk. And that risk assessment allows us to say, okay, you're very high. Detention may be the right intervention right now. Or maybe you're in the middle and we can use one of those alternatives like electronic monitoring, shelter care, supervision, or an evening reporting center. Or you're low risk. And that means you should be just released and go home. It takes away that subjectiveness that was really sort of all over the decision making at the department. It allowed for some sort of structure to be able to say, okay, we're going to have this, but we also still need a little bit of that subjectiveness because there's no such thing as a perfect tool, right? There's mitigating and aggravating factors that always have to be considered, but it also allows the department to take a look at the data, right? So we have now this risk sort of score for everyone who's in detention. So we can look and say, hey, why is 80% of the young people in detention today low risk? What happened here? We need to dig into that. Or they all look high risk. All right, that's sort of what we would expect and how the tool to work. Or there were a lot of overrides. So is the tool not sort of responding to what we're seeing? And it really requires the commitment on ongoing research, analysis, and reflection. We also had to expand those alternatives to detention and making sure they were available everywhere, and really beef up our process for that. The Department of Juvenile Services is unique in the sense that we run our own electronic monitoring program. So when a young person is put on that kind of monitoring, a Department of Juvenile Services employee supervises them, which is great because we can control that in the sense of ensuring that monitoring is operating the way we think it should be, looking at violations and responding to them appropriately. We also removed a lot of barriers in case processing, really, and it was just as easy at looking at that pending placement population, not almost 50% of the kids who are just stuck in detention, and figuring out why is it taking so long for them to be ordered to go to a treatment center and getting there. And there were a lot of efficiencies that could be built in relatively quickly to reduce that time frame and get them to their treatment much quicker. And the reasons why, that was so essential is, you got to think 15, 16-year-old, you're supposed to be going somewhere. You're not going somewhere. You're stuck in this crowded facility. You're mad. You're angry. You're not contributing to a positive culture in the facility. Incidents occur. Incidents lead to bad outcomes for young people. They're not getting what they need in the way of treatment. There's so many unmet needs. So it was not only critical to just have the system work efficiently, it was critical for the outcomes of the young people. And then we needed to really increase the access to diversion and even the department's role in diversion. The department has a big role in looking at those cases when they come to our attention and figuring out, does it even need to go through this justice system? Can we do something else? And we really needed to say, all right, we need to get control of that door and utilize all our tools and leadership to make sure we are making the right decision there, because if they don't even cross over into the formal system, then detention's never an option. We can just go ahead and get services, supports, and do all that outside of the formal system. And then graduated responses. As you saw, when we looked at that doors to detention report, many of the youth were in detention because of sanctions and violations. And that was something when we looked at that, we're like, well, the department can control that. We did that. We put that kid in there. So why are we doing that? And it's because we didn't have a way to assess behavior and noncompliance to identify, is it super severe? Or is there something that we could do in the community that may actually help that young person achieve compliance and get on the right path for success? So we developed a structure that looked at the behavior, looked at the severity, and then provided suggestions and guidance to case managers to be able to use other tools rather than detention to respond to non-compliant behavior. There was also a law change during this time that was quite significant. When we looked at how long young people were staying in detention, it was really all across the board. Some young people would come in for a violation, they see the judge the next day, and they go home. So, well, what was the purpose of, exposing the young person to the traumas of detention if you're going home the next day, right? But then why were they going home the next day and others were waiting 30 or 60 days? for a judge to see them. And what we identified was in some jurisdictions, they were just waiting until the next court hearing, not that next court day, to review the case. And so when you have things happening differently in all these different counties, you know, sometimes internal policy changes can help level the playing field and have a common response. But when it's involving other systems, sometimes you need that law change. And this was a really good opportunity to say, okay, we're doing things differently all around. We just need to change this law and make sure everyone's doing it the same way, instead of being able to wait for that next court hearing, which could be scheduled 30, 60, even 90 days down the road. Any young person who's coming in is going to have their detention immediately reviewed that next court day by a judge. Then we get to youth charge as adults. So just to sort of recap, we did a lot of these, the department really focused on a lot of these procedural internal changes that we did get the benefit of that law change. We worked with our stakeholders, we collaborated to come up with a way that really made a significant impact on the number of young people detained. At the same time, when we started starting to realize the benefit of those strategies, there was a real movement to look at the youth charged as adults in Maryland. So in Maryland, we don't have just a juvenile system, and we don't really just have a criminal system. We sort of have this thing in the middle. And young people as young as 14, if they're charged with murder, or 16 and older if they're charged with violent offenses or handgun violation, they can be charged as adults. What that means is, instead of their complaint coming to the Department of Juvenile Services, it goes to the adult system. It goes to the commissioner. It goes to, they are reviewed for whether or not detention is required or not in an adult jail. And what that led to was a lot of young people in adult jails around the state. Now the federal government has some pretty significant rules. If you were gonna put young people in adult jails, they're supposed to be sight and sound separated. That means you can't see me and you can't hear me at all. Well, we also have to remember, you know, most jails are sort of old. They've been around for a while. They also had a lot of adults, and really that sight and sound thing wasn't happening, which led to some problems in some jurisdictions with their compliance with that. Also, they're not designed for kids. The staff there is not trained in working with young people, understanding all that adolescent development. There's no school. There's no treatment. There's no, you know, pediatrician to, you know, deal with their sort of acute needs and adult detention. And it's a very dangerous place for young people. They're very likely to be victimized and be put in really challenging, horrific, that really just increases that trauma and then the outcomes. And you gotta remember, we're still at the stage where we're not sure they did anything wrong, right? So may not have done anything wrong, still had the right to go through their total process and be innocent and have that, you know, adjudicated by a judge, but still had all, and still do, have all these negative consequences for being placed in a adult jail. So also sort of what spurred at this moment around 2013 was there was a movement because the young people in Baltimore City were held in one of the very old structures that exists in the sort of prison complex, jail complex in Baltimore City. There was a movement to build a new place for them. And also that was also a lot of pressure from the federal government. I mean, like, this is just, these conditions of confinement are just not okay. And I will sort of personally tell you, when I went to see where the young people were held in the adult system, it was one of those moments where you sort of question the humanity that exists, because the conditions were really that challenging, that horrific for young people. And so at the department, we decided we needed to do something. And we brought all the stakeholders together and said, and we found this little sort of line in the law that allowed, if a young person had not yet been determined if they're going to be an adult or not, they're still in that zone of not sure, we're going to charge them as an adult, but we could still send them back to the juvenile system. If they're in that space, they actually could be held in a juvenile detention center. So we used that little line in the law and brought together the public defender in Baltimore City, the judges, and the state's attorney, and came up with an agreement where we filed a motion in every case where a youth was charged as an adult and said, the Department of Juvenile Services is here. We are willing and able to take these young people, and we will hold them in a juvenile facility until that decision is made, whether they're going to come back to the juvenile system or stay in the adult system. And it took a minute to convince everyone. They're like, well, why do you want to do that? Or, is juvenile detention really that safe? And the thing is, it's detention. It's just, it's like adult detention structurally. There are locked doors. There are fences with razor wire. You can't get out. No one can come in. It operates like a correctional facility would on each side. However, it's just at least geared towards young people. They are only around young people. And in Baltimore City specifically, young people have their own rooms, which is a safety issue for the young person to be able to be in their own space. So that worked. We got everyone on board. We held all the young people. Nothing, sky didn't fall, nothing bad happened. And so we worked with our partners in the General Assembly, as well as the Public Defender's Office and advocates to change the law. And just say, you know what, we know it works in Baltimore City, we can do this around the rest of the state. And so let's put into law that there's a presumption when a youth discharges adult that they will be in juvenile detention. The only reason why we could actually do that is you will see between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 13, we really constrained that pending placement box, which is the blue box there. We started really driving that number down by building in the efficiencies and also starting to drive down that green box, which is the juvenile detention population, which freed up the space to be able to take on the youth charges adult population. So sometimes strategies, although are deployed to reduce who's in your facility, this sort of was, another way of looking at it. We brought kids into our facility, but we brought them in from another place that was not providing the best conditions for them into a juvenile facility. So although the overall detention number, sort of fluctuates as you go through the years of 16, 17, and 18, with sort of more kids, it's because we were able to take more and more of that population. Long term, as it relates to youth charges adults, the federal government has said really you can't have kids under 18 in adult jails anymore. Maryland has not taken that leap to completely depopulate the under 18 population because our law says just until we know whether or not you're going to be a juvenile or adult. So once the court says we think your case is severe enough, we want to process it through the adult system, they go back to adult jail and they could still be under the age of 18. So Maryland will have to catch up to that federal mandate probably over the next year or so. But that red box there then is our youth charges of adult population. And so we see that big drop from fiscal year 20 to 21, which we're going to jump into. But first, we're going to talk about one other sort of structural change that we made. So when I talk about really shutting down that front door, in this time period, as we really were targeting all ways to reduce the utilization of incarceration, so this sort of era in that pathway really sort of crosses over into the pandemic time as well as sort of pre-pandemic. But pre-court supervision is one of those options we have when we first get that complaint and arrest from the officer. You can say that when I mentioned earlier, you don't have to do the formal system. We can use pre-court supervision. We can try it out, provide some services, some supervision. If it works, great. You don't have to go down this really punitive route, this route that can really levy some intensive responses. We can just take care of the issue very quickly, right? And so we did a study, the department looked into that data, and it works, right? Incredible outcomes for young people that we divert just from the juvenile system altogether. 96% of youth did not have any new adjudicated offenses while they were under pre-court supervision, and 90% did not have another adjudicated offense during the 1-year follow-up period. You don't really get outcomes that good, really, and many of the things. They were really great. So we're like, how can we leverage just more? And so what the department did was they really reorganized the agency to put some intentional focus and leadership over one of the most important decisions we make. Do you get an opportunity for diversion outside the system, or are you going into the formal system? We also, at that time, were like, well, why should we have to wait until a young person is put on probation, at the end of that continuum, that flow chart that we saw earlier, to get them the service they need? Why wouldn't we just give it to them right at the very beginning? So we took all those services that were available at the deep end of the system and just made them available at the front end of the system. We also made sure that we were not just making decisions solely based on risk, but structured decision making. Because even if a young person is high risk, it doesn't mean there aren't things we can't do to mitigate that risk. And it takes another step, because if we can identify what that risk factor is, there might be something we can do to fix it, or at least mitigate it, right? We didn't have a lot of standards around pre-court at that time, although we knew we were getting some good outcomes. So we added a little more structure to it to build in a little more accountability and credibility with the program, so our partners felt more comfortable with it. We started collaborating with more of our sister agencies like the Department of Social Services and the Department of Health. And we wanted to really make sure we were being very inclusive with our family members. We knew that we were more likely to be able to leverage this diversion if we had the buy-in from the family. And so we made all those changes up front to just eliminate some of these really restrictive responses that could continue through the system. Then we get to the pandemic, right? And that changed everything, in a blink of the eye. And detention became more dangerous, right? It became more dangerous for the staff who were working there and more dangerous for the young people, because we all learned, the congregate care facility was just a breeding ground for the transfer of this virus. I mean, it even became more dangerous for the community. If you were releasing all these people who were in a congregate care facility back into the community and they were carrying the virus, it's just sort of that ball started rolling down the hill and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And it also really opened up. Like, if you remember, in the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about why detention is really dangerous for kids. We've known detention is really dangerous for kids. We know it has a huge impact on their physical, emotional, and mental well-being, right? But COVID allowed us to open the eyes of some others to take a different look at that, because we knew that youth well-being was impacted by being in a congregate care facility. So there was a lot that happened, and it wasn't just the Department of Juvenile Services. It was stakeholders, like the Office of the Public Defender, and it was the judges, who were very explicit that we need to look at detention a little bit more than just that. Are they an impact to public safety or themselves? But is this in their best interest? Is this in their well-being? Is there anything we can do? Anything we can do to mitigate those issues? Because we know their well-being can be very negatively impacted if they're entered detention. That took the recognition of that well-being. It also took a lot of collaboration. So where we've collaborated with stakeholders like the judges and the public defenders and the state's attorneys over the years, that collaboration became more critical and more meaningful, quite honestly, through this period of time. We just started weekly phone calls with everyone. So on Fridays at 9 o'clock, any public defender in the state could join in, hear what's happening with the department, hear what's happening in detention and in our other congregate care facilities, and the steps we were taking to mitigate the issues of COVID. At 9:30, any state's attorney around the state could join the call, and at 10 o'clock, any judge could join the call. And we were sharing all that information all the time. And that allowed for us, one, to be incredibly transparent, which was incredibly necessary. It was such a scary time for everybody, right? But also have some shared solutions that came out of those conversations. And then I think really most importantly, the public defender's office filed a motion with the court, essentially to depopulate the detention facilities and committed facilities. So they're like, it's not safe for all these kids to be there. The administrative judge looked at that and made an administrative order. And there were a lot of those coming during the time because courts were closing. We are starting to use video conferencing. The whole system changed overnight. But one of the other things that changed and what the judges were directed to do was make detention decisions differently and to look at young people's well-being when making that decision, not just looking at public safety, not just looking at the youth safety, but also the youth well-being. And is there anything else you can do to mitigate those risks and get the young person home? And when I say anything, the department really took that seriously, and it was anything. We would call parents and say, hey, we would really like Johnny to come home, have a conversation, be like, well, we want Johnny to come home too, but our grandma and grandpa are in the house and we're really worried because he's been now an exposure with law enforcement, a possible exposure in the community, a possible exposure in this facility. We're like, well, we can test them, but we're also gonna just send you home with all the PPE. Would that make you feel better? Would you feel better if you talked to our lead doctor about how to isolate and how long you need to do that? It was taking anything. Are you worried about not having enough food at this point? We'll just send the food home with you. We really were looking at every option to support families and our young people so they could be returned to their communities. And one of the things that really changed is as we looked at, all these strategies, these policies, their procedures, they were sort of grouping these groups, right? The ATD violators, the new complaint kids, the high-risk kids, the low-risk kids. What happened over COVID is we switched to an incredibly intentional and individualized approach, which meant every week as deputy secretary, I got on with my leadership and looked at every single kid in detention. We talked about every single child. We had the top leadership of the state, the top local leadership, and we went and dug deep and tried to come up with any solution we could to take to the court to have this young person released. It allowed for ownership of local decisions, opportunities for coaching, collaboration, identification of needs. When you're like, okay, well, why don't you try this? Like, well, we don't have that. All right, well, we're going to get you that. Okay. Immediate problem solving, not waiting until a hearing, sharing of our values. And I think that's one thing that I look back at this time as incredibly important was, no one wants to join a call every week and have to do, this is a lot of work. It was around a very intense time of the department. The workload was just very high and it was another thing to do. But in my mind that I shared my values and why I wanted to do this with my team is because if we're going to make the decision to lock a young person up, we're going to take the time, we're going to take the hour each week it takes to look at that young person's needs. And these are things that have come out of the pandemic time and have stayed and really influenced the culture of the Department of Juvenile Services. So detention went down, went way down. And this is sort of just like a really sort of close look at the average daily population. Remember, we were like up in close to 462 kids in 2010. We had this nice period of time where we were around, 294. The blue line is sort of the total detention population. That red line is the juvenile. The green is adult. Those you charge as adults. But then come May, we really dropped that detention number. And we were able to drop that detention number without seeing negative public safety consequences. Young people are doing just fine. They weren't getting rearrested. They weren't violating the conditions of their release. They were doing okay in the community. And I think that's partially because of the situation we were in, with the pandemic, but also I think can really be connected to the level of support that young people were getting to be able to be successful, the level of support parents were getting. And so not only did we see that number go down, if you look at March 3rd, 2020 to September 17th, 2021, there was a huge shift in who was in detention, right? That, we still had in March, we still struggled with those low-risk kids being in detention, the misdemeanor population, the violations of population, although it was coming down, still made up quite a proportion of the population. But what we saw is what you would want to see out of any reform. That level of intervention being used for the most risky young people, those charged with a crime of violence or a felony offense. All right, so I'm going to go sort of quickly through some of these other things as we're running close to the time here. So we had this Juvenile Justice Reform Council, and this Reform Council brought everyone together, all the stakeholders, everyone around the state, experts from around the country, to look at how we reform the system. And many reforms were passed in the law that will also continue to contribute to, hopefully, a decline in the utilization of incarceration, but also codified and made law out of a lot of things we learned through the pandemic, through implementing those policies and strategies. And what that allows now is for sustainable reform, that those are now the rules. They can't be changed through a different policy. They are now the rules to the game. And those really, I'm just going to skip this slide, relate to the minimum age of jurisdiction. The minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction is now 13. Now, there's an exception if you're between 10 and 13, if you're charged with a crime of violence. But for the most part, you can't even come into the system unless you're 13. Intake decisions, they give us a lot more authority to use that pre-court supervision because we showed it worked. And that's the power of the research and the analysis and the evaluation, that we are able to take that and say, hey, this works. Let us have more authority to use it. And so now we can use that for felony offenders. And then return to intake. Look, sometimes cases make their way through court anyway, but you get there and you're like, oh man, really wish we could have used that diversion intervention. Well, now you can. The judge has the ability to send it back as long as everyone agrees. And then detention. So detention can no longer be utilized for misdemeanor offenders unless it involves a handgun, because possession of a handgun is a misdemeanor offense in Maryland, or the child had been adjudicated delinquent at least twice in the preceding 12 months. So that first-time misdemeanor can't come in the door anymore. It shuts the door, right? It also took in a lot of consideration of the things that we learned during the pandemic, that we need the judge to review these cases more frequently, as well as we need to craft plans on, we should always be looking on how we can achieve release, how we can get to release, what could be done. And so now that has to be formally submitted to the court. The one thing that didn't pass is youth charged as adults, and that came out as a recommendation from the council that youth charged as adults should no longer go to the adult system, that they should just be dealt with in the juvenile system. And if their case is so severe, the juvenile judge could send it to the adult system, but they shouldn't start there. And this really shows the differences in the amount of time spent in detention when you're charged as an adult. You average 155 days in fiscal year 2021 just to figure out what system you're going to be in. Whereas if you're charged in the juvenile system, you average 60 days before you actually get the treatment. So it's a completely different length of time. You know, that's basically half a school year, right? That you're waiting just to figure out where you're going to have your trial. Not even figuring out if you're guilty, what the sentence would be, and your treatment. The juvenile system is designed to have a more expedient response because we know we need to be able to get the outcomes that we want. So what did this get us? Over time, it got us a lot of drops, right? 78% decline in offenses coming in the front door. We also had a 64% decline in detention over 10 years. If you just look at that juvenile detention, because remember we brought in the new population, it would be more like an 80% decline over that 10-year journey. And also that led to lower kids having severe and more deep system involvement. It led to budget sort of shifting. Instead of spending all this money on incarceration, let's get some services in our communities, and we were able to shift the budget that way. And we also saw a decline in recidivism. So it's working. We're having a better impact, better outcomes for young people and their families and our communities. So lessons learned, you just can't do one thing, you got to do it all. You have to be innovative, you have to think differently. And the data research and ongoing evaluation was incredibly critical to be able to look at, did it work the way we thought it would? Do we need to make a shift? Are we having outcomes that are like, whoa, this isn't hitting right? And then you have to have that race equity lens. It has to be part of every single decision-making process that any system engages in. But there's still stuff to do. The youth charged as adults are still in adult jails, and they're still being processed through the adult system. Mental health access still is a huge challenge. There are a lot of young people who are incarcerated and should be in a behavioral health institution to get the needs they have. It's not a place Kids having really significant behavioral health issues, detention is a place that makes it worse. We need to evaluate that reform legislation. Is it getting what we thought it would? And continued racial disparities just exist everywhere, and we need to be able to dig deeper. You know, the work isn't done. And there's a bunch of resources that I use to put all this together. So thank you so much for having me. I know I'm probably close to time, but if there's any questions, I think we have a little bit of time.
Yeah, we do have time for questions. Feel free to put your questions into chat. Anybody here have questions?
You mentioned treatment several times. What do you mean by treatment? Or drug rehab or what? What is that?
So our question from the audience here is, I mentioned treatment quite frequently throughout the talk. What does that mean? Is it drug treatment, behavioral health treatment, or something else? I think one thing to remember is the juvenile system is supposed to treat young people. It's not supposed to be punitive. It's supposed to be rehabilitative. So, and treatment means something different to everyone, right? So we do assessments to identify exactly what treatment needs exist and try to pinpoint those and do the best we can to get it right. So that could mean substance use treatment, behavioral health treatment. It can mean, you know, anger, aggression therapy, evidence-based services like multi-systemic therapy, family therapy. It's a huge continuum that is growing all the time and shifting to grow and shift with the diverse needs our kids are presenting with.
Paul, in the chat, I think Kelly had a question. I can read it out. Assistant. Oh, just a nice comment from Kelly. You can chat.
If I can find you, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Click. Am I not seeing it? Maybe here? There.
Oh, there we go. It's just.
Hey. There we go.
Oh, Kelly Quinn. Thank you, Kelly Quinn. Nice to see you on here. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Betsy. I really enjoyed the presentation. Hope everyone online enjoyed, everyone in the audience. And thank you for the nice plug for next week's presentation too.
All right. It should not be missed. It will be a good one. Thank you.